Every single word we speak, from casual conversation to high literature, is governed by a hidden biological geometry. Linguists like Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jakobson realize that speech is actually the simultaneous intersection of two distinct cognitive operations. The first operation is selection. To formulate a thought, we must first choose a specific linguistic unit from a mental database of equivalent options. The second operation is combination. Once a unit is selected, it must be arranged into a larger sequence to create meaning. We can map these operations directly onto a Cartesian plane. This vertical line is the Paradigmatic Axis, representing our capacity for selection. The horizontal line is the Syntagmatic Axis. This axis represents combination, based on contiguity, elements chained in a sequence. To see how this works in practice, let's build the sentence, "The cat sat on the rug." These words chain together horizontally. Look closely at the word cat. In our mental database, we could have chosen dog, boy, or baby. These vertical options are related by similarity. We choose one and link it horizontally. This grid operates on a scale of freedom. In the basic sounds of a language, the code is rigid, but as we combine sentences into larger utterances, our ability to create new contexts increases. This grid functions as a structural baseline for thought, a pattern that only becomes visible when specific regions of the brain are physically damaged. In the mid-20th century, Roman Jakobson examined clinical neurology, specifically aphasia, to see exactly what happens when this linguistic grid fractures. Pathological speech disorders do not degrade language randomly. They split precisely into two diametrically opposed sets of symptoms. Looking back at our graph, the first condition is similarity disorder. This causes the total destruction of the vertical paradigmatic axis. The patient loses the ability to select, substitute, or use metalanguage, meaning they can no longer use one word to interpret another. Take Dr. Kurt Goldstein's example of a physical knife. A patient with this disorder cannot access their vertical column of synonyms. To compensate, the patient traces a horizontal line to the object's functional context. They call the knife an apple parer or a bread knife. Consider the classic bachelor case study. When asked to define the word, a patient with this condition cannot say a bachelor is an unmarried man. Equating two terms requires a vertical substitution. Because their paradigmatic axis is dead, this equational logic is physically impossible for them to execute. However, that exact same patient can casually use the word bachelor if they are discussing a bachelor apartment. The physical, horizontal context of the apartment provides a structural crutch for the word. The artistic consequence of this pathology is extreme. Stripped of the ability to draw similarities, which is the basis of metaphor, the brain defaults entirely to metonymy. When asked to repeat the word God, one patient replied heaven. When asked to define black, they described what you do for the dead. Without the vertical axis of similarity, human thought is trapped in a purely horizontal, physical world of cause and effect contiguity. In the exact opposite condition, contiguity disorder, our graph shows the vertical axis remaining intact, while the horizontal syntagmatic axis shatters. The primary symptom is agrammaticism. The syntactical rules that chain words together into higher units are completely lost. Words with purely grammatical functions, pronouns, prepositions, and articles, are the first to disappear. The complex hierarchy of a sentence collapses into what early researchers called a word heap, resulting in a blunt telegraphic style. Even individual words fracture. Suffixes and prefixes detach from their root words, unable to remain chained together in sequence. Because horizontal context is dead, the patient survives purely through vertical substitution. This creates a heavy reliance on approximate similarities. The patient is forced to identify the world solely through what things are like. For example, a patient might look at a microscope and call it a spyglass, or refer to a gaslight as fire. At its extreme, this disorder degrades into aphasia universalis. Patients lose the ability to horizontally combine basic phonemes, reducing them to a prelingual state. Without the horizontal axis to anchor meaning to reality, the mind becomes unmoored, floating in a chaotic space of pure abstract similarities. In healthy brains, both axes operate continually. But careful observation reveals that individuals and cultures subconsciously favor one axis over the other. Jocobson formalized this preference with his concept of the poetic function. He defined this as the act of projecting the principle of equivalence from the vertical axis of selection into the horizontal axis of combination. We see this projection in the metaphoric pole of literature, which dominated Romanticism and symbolism. The poet Ezra Pound offers a perfect example. In his two-line poem In a Station of the Metro, Pound sets a mundane scene, an underground crowd of commuters. He then makes a vertical leap of similarity, substituting the literal faces in the crowd with petals on a wet black bough. The paradigmatic axis completely dominates the imagery. Conversely, the metonymic pole drives the literary school of realism. Writers like Ernest Hemingway reject metaphor in favor of an intense obsession with horizontal contiguity. In his short story, In Another Country, Hemingway metonymically digresses from the plot to describe the cold physical atmosphere of Milan. He traces a deliberate syntagmatic chain, moving from the city streets to the shop windows to the game hanging outside, down to specific physical details like the fur of foxes and the tails of birds. By emphasizing these contiguous physical details, Hemingway creates symbols of destruction without resorting to a single metaphorical comparison. This geometry expands well beyond modernist American literature. Leo Tolstoy leaned heavily on the metonymic axis, frequently using synecdoche, like bare shoulders or an upper lip, to represent his characters in physical space. The axes map perfectly onto visual art and film as well. Early cinema directors like D.W. Griffith and Charlie Chaplin broke scenes into contiguous close-up fragments, establishing a deeply metonymic visual language. In direct contrast, Servin Eisenstein operated on the metaphoric axis. He overlaid discrete visuals to create film similes, forcing the audience to draw vertical associations between completely separate images in a montage. The surrealist painters lived on the metaphoric pole, painting dreamlike substitutions. The cubists anchored themselves to the metonymic pole, fracturing singular objects into a contiguous set of synecdoches. Metaphor and metonymy are not merely figures of speech. They are the two cognitive operations that organize human expression, providing the essential coordinates for every sentence we construct and every image we create.